Moses went to the mountain, and God spoke unto him.
Moses, this is the Lord thy God, commanding you to obey my law. Do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. A deaf man could hear you.
What?
Nothing, Gonish, forget it. Oh, Lord, why have you chosen me? What would you have me do for you?
I shall give you my laws, and you shall take them unto the people.
Yes, Lord! Lord, I shall give these laws unto thy people. Hear me! Oh, hear me! All pay heed! The Lord Jehovah, has given unto you these 10 commandments for all to obey.
Okay, there he is. Here, okay, we're good now. All right, awesome. Good to have all of you here. Welcome to Grace Life TV here in El Paso. We're just glad to have you with us, as well as all of you joining us online as well. I was trying to think. I thought I wrote it down and I didn't. The people that were from other countries. I looked at earlier this week. There's lots and lots and lots of people that watch us online every week. I mean, there's thousands of videos that people watch. Sermon videos every week, and all not around the United States, but literally all over the world, and France and Belgium and Germany and the Russia Confederation. Matter of fact, I think that was one of the top ones this last week was the Russia Confederation, which is, man, you think that's really cool because, I don't know what kind of, religion they have over there or what kind of religious freedom they have over there, but you know what? Online is a secret way to get the message, and maybe the government wouldn't know if that's the case over there. I really don't know. But it's really good to have all of you here today here at Grace Life in the El Paso campus. I just want to thank you for joining us today. This is a beautiful day in El Paso. I'm supposed to be about, 95 here today or something like that, which is a little warmer than what it's been this last week. And so we're going to enjoy it anyway. This is week number 4 of our new series called Mirror, Mirror. And in this series, what we've been talking about, and what we're going to finally be able to do is begin today and next week. Today we're going to begin looking at what Paul means in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 18 when he says, "But we all with unveiled face behold as in a mirror the glory of the Lord are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as from the Lord the Spirit." We're going to take a look at that verse in more detail, actually in a fairly good detail next week. But first of all, we've got to answer some questions in order for us to get there. Because earlier in this passage, Paul has talked about some other things. So in other words, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to get the context of the Scripture, this particular passage, in order to understand what's going on, right? I mean, like with any book or story or whatever, poem, doesn't matter. Whatever it is, you've got to get the context before you can understand. Context is everything, is it not? I mean, anybody could pick a verse out of somewhere, or even a passage out of a book somewhere, or like they do now during the election, right? There's lots of that going on. Even with videotape, they do that. They pick a section out and they make a person say something that maybe they really didn't say. It's out of context. You really don't know what they meant, what they were talking about when they said that. That's actually happened to me publicly many years ago when I lived up at Cuba, New Mexico. They interviewed me on TV one time, and they took my words and cut them apart and made me say what I didn't say. Literally ruined my reputation in the community because of that. Literally did. Because they heard me say it. It was on TV. They heard me say it. That's not what I said. They picked it all apart and made me say something I didn't. So I understand what that's like. And I really hate it. I really do. I learned to really hate it at that point. So we've got to get the context of what he's talking about here. So that we are certain not to make something more of this or something different of this than what he actually says. So Paul actually leads up to saying what he says in this verse by talking about the time in the Old Testament when Moses put a veil over his face. How many of you ever read that story or heard that story or know anything about that story? Okay, some of you do. We're going to take a look at that in a little more detail. The Old Testament version, so we can get an idea of what Paul is talking about here in 2 Corinthians, right? Still, context is everything. We've got to understand what happened originally, what Paul is referring to when he talks about the original story, all of those different kind of things. So check this out. In verses 12 and 13, he says, in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, he says, "Therefore, having such a hope, we use great boldness in our speech and are not like Moses, who used to put a veil over his face so that the sons of Israel would not look intently at the end of what was fading away." Okay. Now that verse in itself is really, really interesting. There's a lot of stuff there. A lot of things there that we might not readily hit us in the face or hit our minds. So as we go back then to the original story, what we're going to find out, we need to know what this is all about, right? We need to know what this is all about. I mean, why did Moses put a veil over his face to begin with? And what was he covering up? What was he covering up? And what was it that was fading away? And why? Right? All of those are valid questions. We've got to understand all that stuff before we can ever go down to what Paul finally concludes with here in verse 18 and says, here it is. This is what I'm saying to you, right? Here's what you got to know. Okay. So receiving the Ten Commandments, so we go back. The story actually begins when Moses was on Mount Sinai and he was receiving the Ten Commandments from God, which actually this is now the second time that he has done this. Because I think if you remember, if you know anything about that particular account, you remember that Moses, when he came down the first time, he found that the Israelite people had made a golden calf and were already worshiping it. He hadn't been gone that long. And they'd already melted down all their jewelry and had made a golden calf, and they were worshiping his golden calf. And he just threw the stone tablets on the ground and broke them up. So this is now the second time that this has happened. So contrary to Mel Brooks, I mean, I like that version. I really do. You know, I think it's cool. It's funny. It's great. But contrary to Mel Brooks, God didn't just miraculously just say, here they are. You know, Moses didn't show up on the mountain and God gave him these big stone tablets and said, here it is, take these down there. It didn't happen that way. And there wasn't 15. There actually was an original 10. It wasn't an original 15 and then he broke one. There was actually 10. The 10 Commandments were inscribed on those tablets. So the Bible actually tells us that Moses spent 40 days and 40 nights up there on the mountain. That's a long time. That's a long time. And all of that time, then, he was, at least from the text, I gather that he was inscribing on these stone tablets these commandments that God was giving him as he was giving them to him, all those different kind of things. Now, naturally, my mind starts to wander. When I read something like that, I start to wonder about the particulars even about that. You know, were the stone tablets already there? I mean, were they already, did God cut them out of the mountain and say, here they are? Did he just find some really nice flagstone? You all know what flagstone is, right? You ever been anywhere where you can collect flagstone? It's really cool. It's good stuff. There are only certain places you can get it, and it can be kind of a little hard to find sometimes. You know, did he just find some nice flagstone and then you start inscribing the Ten Commandments on those? Did he have to actually carve the stone tablets out of the mountain? What kind of tools did he use? Did he take some tools with him? You know, all of which are really immaterial to what we're talking about here today. Have nothing to do with it. That's just where my mind wanders, okay? I'm just, open it up and let you speak in there for a minute. It's not a pretty sight, let me tell you. So let's read the rest of the account. Let's go ahead and look at it together. It came about when Moses was coming down from Mount Sinai, and the 2 tablets of the testimony were in Moses' hand as he was coming down from the mountain, that Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because of his speaking with him. So Aaron and all the sons of Israel saw Moses. Behold, the skin of his face shone, and they were afraid to come near him. Then Moses called to them, and Aaron and all the rulers of the congregation, and they returned to him, and Moses spoke to them. So this is the original guy. This is all after all that other stuff we just talked about that was immaterial to the story, right? Afterwards, it says that he came down and he brought the commandments with him, and his face was shining, all those different kind of things. So I'm actually really glad that the Bible tells us exactly how many tablets he had in his hand? Because that answered that question for me too. That's the only question I really did get answered. But what's really interesting about this particular account with God is that after Moses was with God and spoke with God, the skin of his face shone. That's crazy, isn't it? That's kind of crazy. Now, I don't know about you. I don't know if it had to because of the way I was raised or just the way my mind works or whatever. I always thought that Moses put a veil over his face because, of course, naturally after Moses had been with God, right? It said that's what causes his face to shine, that his face shone from the reflection of God's glory. Make sense? I always thought that's what that was. So that the reason he put a veil over his face was so that people they just couldn't bear to see it. Matter of fact, I think I was taught that actually, now I think about it. It's coming back to me, listening to a sermon where the pastor, who was my dad, said that they couldn't bear to look at the glory of God. That's what the problem was at that particular point. And then after a while, we see in the text here that it says this glory started to fade away, and so then he would cover his face again. And then he'd go back to God, and he'd uncover his face while he was with God, and his face would shine again, he'd come back. So how are you even know certain that really sounds right? I don't believe that's what's going on here. I don't think that's what's happening here. And we'll look at that because you need to see what's going on, and we need to look at it carefully, and you can decide for yourself. I have, and I think you'll see what we're talking about, or what Paul is actually, or what this story is actually about. So, there's a problem here, because if that truly were the case, that Moses being with God and his face shone, and that then the shining faded away, and then he'd cover his face back up with the veil, then what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 3:13 about the glow fading away would probably mean that the longer he was away from God, the weaker his batteries got. That's one way to say it. Or, from a spiritual standpoint, I would say that, well, the Holy Spirit hadn't been given yet, right? So since the Holy Spirit hadn't been given yet, then when he was with God, then he had this glow about him. And the longer he was away from God, and the longer he was with sinful people and in the sinful world, and especially his own sins, then the glory of God would fade away, and his sinful stuff would take over, and it would gradually fade away. That's what I thought. Anybody else thought that? You never thought about it. Okay, well, think about it. However, if that were the case, if that is the case, I have some serious questions. For example, why did God say, why did Paul say here, that the reason Moses put a veil over his face was so that the sons of Israel would not look intently at the end of what was fading away? Okay, I got it. Maybe it was because he didn't want them to see that he was losing the glory of God, that he actually was a real sinful person himself. Okay, all right, okay, that's cool. That's a thought. But Paul didn't say that Moses was covering up the brightness of the glow, nor was he even covering up the fact that the glow was fading away. Read it carefully. He wasn't covering up the fact that the glow was fading away. Instead, what Paul says is that he didn't want them looking intently at the end of what was fading away. Now, I checked the original Greek. It's all there. It's there. Moses was covering up the end of what was fading away. I know this is kind of deep, but hang with me because it's really cool. It's really interesting. You've got to be a real scholar you got to. I shouldn't say it that way. That makes me sound conceited. You got to really study. You got to look at it for yourself and really look at it to find out what's going on here. You can't just take a cursory look and say, okay, that's what it's about. because that's what I've done for years. And I think that's what a lot of people have done as well. The second problem with that theory or idea that the glow was simply from being with God and is that why were the people afraid of the glow? Remember we read a moment ago that it said the people ran away from him because they were afraid of the glow? They ran away from him. They didn't run to him, they ran away. And he had to call them back, including the leaders that were under him. Had to call them all back and say, dude, it's cool. It's all right. It's me. Right? They were afraid and they ran away. So if it were the awesomeness of God that was glowing from Moses' face, then wouldn't the people have fallen down in total worship instead of running away in fear? I mean, anytime, as far as I can read, any time and every time that people in the Bible came in contact with the holiness and the awesomeness of God, they never ran away. They weren't able to. They fell on their faces. So why did they run away? Something else going on here, right? Has to be. Because anytime the glory of God shows up at any point in time, people are either struck dead, or they fall on their faces in total. They can't run away, It's that fight or flight thing. There's a third one. What is it? Fright. Flight, fight. You either run away, you fight, or you just stand there in total fear, total fright. You can't move. That's what happens when people encounter God. They fall on their face. They can't move. And yet the Bible specifically says that the people ran away from Moses in fear. So if it's the glory of God shining on his face, then what's the problem, right? It's not about God forcing this kind of thing to happen. Okay, so here's a side note. This extra won't cost you nothing. That's exactly why, the whole reason why, the same kind of reasoning why people quote that verse in the Bible that says, every knee shall bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is God, right? That Jesus to the glory of God. Because that's a misquote when you read it, when most people see it that way. Because it's not God forcing anyone to give their allegiance to him. Same thing's happening here. God doesn't force anyone and say, you will bow to me. It's when they get in the presence of God, they don't have a choice. It's like seeing something for the first time and you say, it is real. I've been told about it all my life, never believed it. It is real. God is who he says he is. That's what it's about. That's why every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. We can't help it. Just like they wouldn't have run away from Moses, they would have fallen on their faces and at least worshipped God, if nothing else. Meaning that running in fear from Moses because his face shone with the glory of the Lord doesn't make any sense at all. So what is going on here? What is happening? What is this all about? I'd like to know. Would you like to know? I'd like to know. Because we've looked at some of the options, and there probably are others. I don't know. Those are the options I was thinking of and things I thought of. But actually the content of this entire chapter is literally about the Ten Commandments, the Old Testament law. Check it out. Paul begins in verses 5 and 6, and he says, now that we are, not that we are adequate in ourselves to consider anything as coming from ourselves, but our adequacy is from God, who also made us adequate as servants of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. So the subject matter of chapter 3 of 2 Corinthians is about the Old Testament law. Okay? No doubt about that. The subject matter within this chapter, within this whole conversation that Paul's having with us, is about the Old Testament law. So, in other words, what he's saying here is that trying to live by the letter of the law will do nothing more than kill you. I can attest to that. You ever tried to live by God's law? I did for many, many, many years. You can't do it. You can be as good as you want to be, as you can be, and it still ain't good enough. As a matter of fact, no less than 3 times in these few verses, the law is said to kill you. It's called the ministry of death, and it's also called the ministry of condemnation. Yeah. Well, why? That's what it's supposed to do. Drive you to the realization that you can't get good enough on your own. You have to have something else outside of you, who is Jesus Christ. Because there's no way that any person could ever live up to God's standard of holiness. Not possible. And even if you could, you still couldn't get to heaven on that basis, because it's not about that. Okay. So here's where we then, and after all of that, here's where we begin to see the answer to our question about what was that glow on Moses' face, and what's that all about? Well, verse 7, he says, but, or however, if the ministry of death, what's that? The Old Testament law. 10 Commandments. If the ministry of death in letters engraved in stone, obviously, right? What else can it be? If it's engraved on stone, he's talking about Moses. He's still talking about Moses. That's the subject matter. Talking about Moses, getting the 10 Commandments from God. He said, if the ministry of death in letters engraved on stones, which is the Old Testament law, came with glory, so that the sons of Israel could not look intently at the face of Moses because of the glory of his face fading as it was. So what is glowing on Moses' face? The glory of the Old Testament law. That's what he said. Is that what he said? That's what he said. So he's saying that the glow that is on Moses' face is all about this glory of the Old Testament law. The awesomeness and gloriousness of God's law. So how many of you ever thought about the 10 Commandments as being glorious? Well, I haven't either. But you know, I had to stop when Paul says that that's what this was about. And I've read that verse before, many times before, saying that if the Old Testament law came with glory, then how much more glory is there to come? I'm thinking, Old Testament laws with glory? Well, you know, how can the Old Testament commandments be called glorious or awesome, especially after he's just said 3 times it'll kill you, it's a ministry of death, all those different, right? And then he says, well, it comes with glory. Well, okay. Well, let's look at it this way. What could be better than the perfection of God's law that not only protects those who live by them, but condemns those who do not? For example, I'm really glad that God said, you can't sleep with my wife. And I'm really glad that God said, you can't murder my children. And you can't steal my stuff. That's glorious. That's awesome. Right? If it weren't for that, wouldn't we be living in total chaos? I mean, we already are. I mean, our country, we're not upholding the 10 Commandments anymore at all. We're putting God completely out of everything. And we're seeing the chaos getting worse and worse every day. There's no doubt about it. Not in my mind. Well, what if we didn't have any law? Well, if we didn't have any laws like that, human laws on this level, we'd be in big trouble, wouldn't we? So God's law is glorious, is it not? Hallelujah, I'm glad they're there. Because that's where all the other stuff comes from. All the other laws that are on our land, well, the majority of them come from, are based on this. Our country was founded on this, on the 10 Commandments. Right? Yeah. So I'm really glad that God says you can't, you can't, you can't. And that he also says, if you do, here's what happens, right? Because that not only protects me from on that level, but also protects me from you ever doing that again. to somebody else, or me again, or if you did it to somebody else, it protects me from you doing it, all that kind of things, right? So absolutely, there's glory. It reminds me of, how many of you have seen The Shootist, the movie, The Shootist, John Wayne? His last movie, actually, he was dying of cancer in that movie, and he was actually dying of cancer while he made the movie. And there's one line in there where he says, I won't be wronged, I won't be insulted, I won't be laid a hand on, I don't do these things to other people, and I require the same of them. Same thing. You bet there's glory in God's 10 Commandments. As a matter of fact, Paul points out in Romans 7 is that the law is holy and the commandment is holy and righteous and good. Absolutely it is. However, Paul's point here in 1 Corinthians, or 2 Corinthians chapter 3 is that there was something even more glorious on the horizon. That's why he's saying it's fading away. Oh, now we're getting somewhere, huh? This is cool. Something is coming that is of so much greater glory than the law of the Old Testament. Something more glorious so much more glorious is coming that when it arrives, it is absolutely going to blow your mind. Okay, so look at it again. He says, how will the ministry of the Spirit fail to be even more with glory? For if the ministry of condemnation has glory, much more does the ministry of righteousness abound in glory. For indeed, what had glory in this case has no glory because of the glory that surpasses it. In other words, what's coming is so much more glorious. It's like, who would want that? And that's what we all said a minute ago. Why would I want to live by the 10 Commandments? What's coming is so much more glorious that it's like, that don't have any glory. Well, it does. That's what he's saying. It's because of the surpassing glory of what's to come. For if that which fades away was with glory, much more that which remains is in glory. Wow. Wow. There's some cool stuff there. So what's the answer then? We talked about this fading away and all those other. What's the glow on Moses' face? And what was it that the Israelites wanted to look intently at? More specifically, what was the end of what was fading away? Are you beginning to, I hope your wheels are beginning to turn. I can see smoke rolling out some of your ears. Smell like burnt rubber. What do you mean? I'm kidding you. What was the end of what was fading away? And that was what Moses did not want them looking intently at. I hope it's beginning to make sense. Well, you got to ask, what was fading away? What was fading away? The Old Testament law was fading away. Yes, the glory of the law, the Old Testament law. So the end of what was fading away was nothing more than Big G grace. He didn't want them looking intently at what was to come. As a matter of fact, the New Testament tells us that even the angels longed to look into what was to come. They wanted to really bad. So Moses covered his face so they wouldn't see it. So they wouldn't look intently at it. They could see it, but they wanted to look intently at it and say, whoa, what's this about? Dude, that's awesome. I want to know more. And Moses covered his face. Yeah. So how do I know that? Well, because the law was only temporary. It was fading away. And soon to be replaced. Depending on your perspective. If you lived 3,000 years ago, that wouldn't be very soon. Or 10,000 years ago, that wouldn't be very soon to be replaced. If you were the Israelites back then and it was to be replaced and you didn't know when, it wasn't very soon. It certainly didn't come in their lifetime or in a lot of lifetimes after that. But it was soon to be replaced with something infinitely, infinitely more glorious. Because the law was not even able to make holy those who lived by it. Wow. Wow. Just to throw a little bait out there for next week. God alone knows who He has created you to be. He alone is able to transform you into the image of His Son. And when He does that, Jesus is uniquely represented in you. We look in a mirror and we don't see it all. What are we looking at? God's awesome. Lord bless you.